Welcome to Frankly Speaking with Dr. Wade. This show was created for and inspired by the thousands of patients I've served, so it's time for me to speak up and speak out on their behalf. With a wide range of experts, we bring you weekly insights, diving deep into topics of controversy to bust through the sugar coating that keeps you and your family stuck in the mainstream. Hey everybody, thanks so much for being here. Today I want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. It's actually a little even more than that. It's called iron overload, and what's most important is the discovery of what iron overload looks like. So the first question you might ask is, why are we talking about iron overload? Aren't most people anemic? Like, I know so-and-so, she's anemic. I know my daughter's anemic. I know my aunt is anemic, and on and on and on. So yes, there is this prevalence and conversation around many people you might know that are anemic. That goes on. And one of them is, first of all, there's literally billions of folks that are both anemic and in iron overload. There is at least 1 million folks in the United States that have been diagnosed with hemochromatosis. What does that even mean? Hemochromatosis, which is a genetic condition that predisposes the individual to being iron toxic or having an iron overload system. And behind the smoke and mirrors that society has, and because your doctor hasn't mentioned iron overload, that's exactly why we're having the conversation right now. So just to set the foundation, iron overload can happen as a result of a number of things that were put into play in the United States as early as 1941, when it was initiated as common practice to start putting iron into the food. And then it was perpetuated through 1958 with what was called the Delaney Clause. And this legislation was about the acknowledgement that carcinogens should not be found in food. Anything known to be carcinogenic should not be put in our food, yet inorganic forms of iron were still allowed, and that was one of the exceptions. So why that happened, I'm not sure, and it's just something that still somehow was perpetuate in our food and is continuing to be fortified to date. In Jim Moon, PhD's book, Iron, the Most Toxic Metal, he states and cites 2,400 researched articles on iron and the toxicity that iron has. So yes, it's a double-edged sword. It is very, very crucial to life that we have enough iron, and at the same time, it's very crucial that we don't have too much iron, and that's a delicate balance within the body. So many of you are asking, why is iron put in if it has that capacity to be toxic as well and be harmful to the body? It was introduced into our food system as a result of pregnant mothers and infants needing that. So that's just, again, reminding that this food source, this fortification came from a small portion of our population to serve them, and yet we're all consuming those levels. So I'm not sure why. There's theories as to the controversial aspects of why that's still in our food system and why as a global, for all ages, that we are being forced with that type of level of iron. I'm not sure, and I don't have that answer for you. The relevance, just to give you an indication why we're going in depth with iron overload, is iron overload creates what's called oxidative stress and increases your reactive oxidative species, which is in the body called ROS, which is all kinds of chemical reactions that lead and basically are exposed to oxidation, and you know that antioxidants help reduce that. So the first thing is, if you take antioxidants, are you actually reducing your iron toxicity? The quick answer is no, you are not. Are you helping your body in some way? Yes, you are. You're just not actually reducing the iron toxicity with antioxidant supplements or antioxidant foods alone. So we can get back more into the details of that. This is opening the door to a conversation. If you struggle with anything where you have chronic inflammation, that's either being treated through drugs and medicine, chiropractic care, acupuncture, a nutritionist, your diabetic doctor, whatever it might be, your heart doctor, your Alzheimer's, dementia, neurologist, doctor, okay? So when we look at that and we look at the top 4 syndromes, that's exactly why we're having this conversation. Heart disease, stroke, cancer, dementia and Alzheimer's, and diabetes. Actually, there's 5. Cancer gets put into that as well. But those 4 to 5 diseases that are linked to chronic inflammation that are actually preventable happen to stem off of inflammation. Well, one primary driver of inflammation in the body that runs rampant and is untreatable until you actually get the iron levels lower is iron toxicity or iron overload syndrome. And for those of you who don't know if you're actually a hemochromatosis or a hemochromatosis condition or patient that has this genetic factor, then you won't know that until you actually have some genetic testing. And when you do, you'll find out whether you are either homozygous, HFE, where you actually carry both traits, one from each parent, which is the same, or you have heterozygous, which is you have one from a parent but not the other, and therefore you're a carrier and you may not express those genes, but you still can. The real point is that you don't jump to the conclusion whether you're a hemochromatosis, but that your first step is check your iron levels. So if you struggle with anything I just mentioned, arthritis, you have chronic inflammation, you have digestive problems, you've been classified as anemic, yes, as anemic as a woman or as anemic as a man, and you start to look at, is this an actual iron anemia, a lack of iron anemia, or is this another form of anemia that's just treated with iron, but you still are not getting your energy back where you need to be, and you're actually not anemic from iron. You're anemic from something in the system or the metabolism of iron. Okay, and those are very different things which you can get into later. But to talk about iron overload right now is you have to understand if you're dealing with any of those previous listed syndromes, such as stroke, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, or Alzheimer's dementia, which is inflammation of the brain, also known as type 3 diabetes, because it's also an insulin resistance problem. When you look at your dietary habits, we have to be able to, our body requires oxygen, and iron is a major carrier and major essential metal for your body to be able to carry oxygen and deliver oxygen to the tissues. And it is of great need in the body. There just needs to be a balance. So I want to repeat that. Iron isn't to be labeled bad. Iron is to be understood as to the role it plays in health, from having too much in its toxicity levels and how it destructs everything, literally creating rust in the body, as well as the advantage of having a healthy enough level of iron, but looking at the resource you get from iron. So back to the Delaney law that we talked about when it went into legislation. This law, back in 1958, was about protection, and it was about preventing the additives that were carcinogenic or toxic to the body to be put in our food. They did allow for one to continue that, again, is essential it's an essential micronutrient for our bodies to carry oxygen, essential for life here on Earth in many cases, from plants and animals all across the board. But it's also one of the most toxic micronutrients we have when it's out of balance. And it can get out of balance based on a number of things, and it's quite overlooked in this mainstream medicine. For example, in 1996, the CDC did a survey regarding hemochromatosis patients. They found that about 12% were diagnosed as psychiatric, 17% were prescribed iron pills, and another 18% reported that they had taken iron pills, likely for a complaint of fatigue. Patients saw an average of 3 physicians and waited an average of 9 years before a diagnosis was established. So it brings us back to the original question of, if this disease is so common, then why is it not a household word? And this is from an excerpt from the book, The Iron Disorders Institute, A Guide to Hemochromatosis. So if you have symptoms or you know somebody with these symptoms, then consider the fact that you need to check their iron levels for inflammation. chronic fatigue, joint pain, heart arrhythmia, chest pain, heart attack, skin color changes, diabetes or pre-diabetic, abdominal pain, elevated liver enzymes, cirrhosis, elevated iron, cancer, emotional changes, depression, hair loss, infertility, loss of desire for sex, and impotence. Any one of these can lead to it. And I would add in there chronic pain and inflammatory syndromes around digestion that are not responsive or super sensitive. Postmenopausal women also have an increased risk of heart disease as a result, in theory, and this is postulated by several involved with understanding iron overload syndromes and hemochromatosis, is that once women have stopped giving blood on a regular basis monthly with their menstrual cycle, so postmenopausal women, and having higher levels of estrogen, create a greater affinity for iron accumulation in the body. Therefore, women that are postmenopausal catch up to men's risk. Remember, they're not losing blood on a monthly basis that is allowing them to dump that iron on a regular basis, which is why historically there's a greater disposition for men to show hemochromatosis symptoms and or iron accumulation than women prior to menopause. There's this wonderful dance between iron. What I'm trying to help you address is, can you go ask your doctor if you've struggled with this inflammatory piece? Can you rule out something very, very simple by actually getting some blood work done that can really simplify it? And it is not expensive. I'm going to give you two options. Basically, ask your provider first. Go through them whenever possible. Use those benefits. Use the benefits from the standpoint, and I'm just pulling a resource here as we're speaking. And what I want you to do is look for 4 different blood tests, okay, for iron. And the iron panel that you need, and most will do this generically, but they'll only do a portion of it, not all of it, unless you ask for the specific iron panel. So what you want to look at is 4 things. You want to look at transferrin iron, which is a transporter of iron. You want to look at total iron binding capacity, TIBC. You also want to look at transferrin saturation. It could be listed as iron saturation. And then you want to see serum ferritin. Now, there's a couple other ones that may come with that, but you need those 4 to get the most accurate reading of where your iron levels are from the blood, as well as the best you can do, and we cannot get that level in the actual tissues where blood actually, what the tissue levels of iron are. Because that there's a couple ways, but they're extremely expensive and unrealistic. Aside from taking tissue biopsies from each one and measuring, which they're not going to do, and it's painful. But in some cases, they will check that through the liver to see the state of the liver, for example, from hepatitis or cirrhosis as a result of iron toxicity, because iron is stored in the liver as well as other tissues. For example, myoglobin is the muscle form of hemoglobin that actually carries oxygen to the muscles. It's important to have enough iron for your muscles to function well. But if you are iron toxic, too much iron, then you get rigidity, rust, you get soreness in the muscles. Every time you exercise, you're slow to recover. I mean, how many of you go through some of that? I want you to hear something very specific. It doesn't mean everyone is iron toxic. It just means rule that first piece out. And here's why. If you are getting treated for something of inflammation and you have not checked the iron levels, and you're an adult or you're a postmenopausal woman or even premenopausal and you've been treated for anemia, get this blood test done quite simply to determine where your iron levels are. If you find out they're high, you have one first step solution to solving your problem. Because then once you go through the steps of donating blood, or what's called therapeutic phlebotomy, where you donate blood to dump the iron, that is the most effective, most cost-effective, and effective, efficient way to reduce your iron levels and have a significant bearing on iron toxicity in the body. You need to see your doctor given those circumstances. So that's my first message, is see your doctor about this. Rule that out. If your doctor doesn't take it seriously, get a different doctor. If your doctor doesn't have great experience with it, get a different doctor. Or educate them on it. This specific condition will undermine all your efforts. And I say that with experience. It will undermine all your efforts in trying to feel your best, trying to heal like you need to heal, or function in your everyday life, whether it be through working out and exercising and always having pain as a result of that or recovering too slowly. When you can't function normally, okay, you're going to chase. You'll see providers. You'll take pain meds. You're going to try to calm the fire of pain, and you're actually missing it. So if you rule this out and you find out your levels of iron and where they are within a normal range, you can shove it aside and say, okay, great, that's not my problem. Now I can go to that next step. But anything treating inflammation on top without assessing this is going to leave you missing one of the most valuable pieces to solving your chronic pain or chronic inflammation or acute inflammation problem that your body is struggling with. And again, some of these other symptoms aren't going to be heart disease, stroke, cancer, Alzheimer's. Hopefully you don't experience any of that, both from yet and that you just don't, period. But it does show up more and more as a result of what's happening here. So where you ask, we can talk about where the foods are fortified with iron, and mainly it's all the grains. If you look at any nutritional bar, you look at any back of health food, anything packaged or commercialized or produced, processed, at whatever level, you have to understand when there's iron being fortified into your flours, into all the cooking flours. In the United States, that is the rule. It is put into our flours and grains. It's refortified with iron. The problem is you have to understand that's an inorganic form of iron, and it is carcinogenic. And those who still doubt this, fine, go ahead, doubt. I really don't care about whether you doubt, believe me or not. The reality is, if you're struggling, it's an easy solve for you if you just rule this out with your doctor. That's my advice. And I say that as a provider who's checked now a good couple dozen patients since I've learned about this, and seen that of those patients, I literally have hand-selected about 23 patients. And of those, I'm at just over, so it's over 50% have been high in iron toxic. Significance there is, yes, that is a small sample group. I completely agree. But what's surprising to me is the challenges they're having. I mean, these are some chronic struggling patients, whether they be inflamed or from an immune response, why they're autoimmune. A couple have been diagnosed as anemic, and they're truly not actually iron anemic. It's a metabolic fact that they're low on energy as a result of not enough. In this case, one specifically is copper balance, which helps metabolize iron. And the other one was with methylation, the body's ability to synthesize energy through its biochemistry, through the processes of getting energy to the cell. And what happens is if we can't process something because we have what's called a genetic SNP, which is a mutation or a dirty gene, which is the expression of a mutation, then you don't break down and assimilate nutrition the same way everyone else might, which everyone doesn't do it the same anyways because of our genetic history, familial traits, all of the fact that we're exposed to these toxins and they change how our genes express themselves. That's why you may not have gotten away. You may not have had a problem with, for example, milk when you were 12, 15, 18, and all of a sudden at 27 or 35, it bugs you. You're not necessarily lactose intolerant. However, your body is having a hard time breaking something down in milk. In many cases, it's casein. In other cases, it's the fact that there's growth hormone. And in other cases, it's the fact that your body just can't handle that load, among other things, because dairy can be inflammatory. So without throwing dairy into the, under the bus, what we're saying is you can look at certain foods as well as something like iron levels to determine and rule out, is that my problem? If not, great, move to the next step. If it is your problem, you've got to get that lower and then go back to your program and see where you're at. Here's what I've seen with my patients specifically, and that's not even mentioning myself, all right, is that once we discover this and we start going through therapeutic phlebotomies to get that done, either I go through their doctor and have them and refer them back and have them help them with it, A, to get a second opinion, B, to take action and make that prescription for them. And so the patient gets and hears this from someone else other than myself. 2 is that the patients can start to manage this on their own, and then we can come back around and see those levels of iron lower. What I'm hearing automatically is after 1 or 2 phlebotomies from someone that has been high in iron for quite some time, is they already start to feel some relief. And it's fantastic to get that feedback so quickly. I didn't necessarily have pain or discomfort where I was getting the relief from mine, but mine showed up in other areas, which I'll share later. And not necessarily in this episode, because that'll make it too long. But I will put an episode up as to where this came from in my history. So that's how I stumbled across this. And when I worked through my process, I realized this is not being addressed medically because of the experience that I had. No one was taking it serious, and everything was a hurdle. It was an obstacle here, it was an obstacle there, and it was lack of knowledge here, lack of knowledge there, not seeing the big picture. And so it put me into a position where I had to go get answers, I had to find my own solution, and then I built a strategy that actually yields results and is reproducible. And that's what I'll ultimately end up teaching, and that I'm creating a better system for. But ultimately, I want to help more people understand where this might fit in, why they continue to struggle with chronic inflammation, or they're opening themselves up to the top 5 disease and death rates in terms of the United States, and why those don't have to happen once you get some of this under control and you break free from the SAD, the Standard American Diet, that perpetuates iron overload and copper insufficiency, or copper insufficiency, low copper levels in the body. So understand, iron overload is a toxic syndrome for the body, increasing oxidative stress, increasing reactive oxidative species, which is the result of oxidative stress, creating the wrong types of byproduct from methylation, in this case, hydroxyl, hydrogen peroxide molecules that are toxic to the body and break the body down prematurely, which is equal to rust. It's like rusting the body from the inside out. So unless this is caught, which in most men isn't till their late 40s, 50s, a lot of the damage has been done. And there'll be some connection I'll help paint with this, but I know this is an audience that has to become aware. They've either struggled with some health issues, or they have someone they know that has had that experience, but nobody has encouraged them, not even their doctor, given the situation that the healthcare system's under. They don't focus on this as a primary source of disease. They're still at treating disease. And unless you ask them or you request it, or someone like me is paying attention to this for the reason of, hey, this is not responding like we'd expect, or this is pretty deep and rampant, we should look at this as a possible cause to rule that out. And if we rule it out, great, you can again move on. So it's not to set a fear flag, it's to bring your awareness up so you can start to ask some better questions, A, to your provider, B, your chiropractor, whoever else you might hire to be an alternative holistic provider, and then you can work along those lines to rebalance some of these areas. And then we can talk about nutrition specifically around how does one eat and how does one still enjoy life along the lines of having iron overload once you get your iron levels down. And maybe you rule out whether you are hemochromatosis or you carry the homozygous or the heterozygous gene, to whether or not you perpetuate this and this is a lifestyle now that you have to make, and here's what you do from a therapeutic phlebotomy standpoint, tongue twister. And so as we go through that, then we can start to narrow that down. Any questions, any shares, any questions around this, please shoot them my way. I'm happy to address it. I've been in the throes of this because of a personal, I am a genetic hemochromatosis patient, and I discovered it on my own, and I've solved that problem on my own. And I'm not only studied nutrition, I've not only studied nutrition for 26 years, this took it to a whole new depth as to how I apply a ketogenic type diet, a paleo type diet, an anti-inflammatory, and an autoimmune diet to understand each one of those and how they fit in, and how you can eat well, eat healthy, enjoy food, and keep your iron toxicity low, or keep your iron levels within a healthy range. Thank you for listening to Iron Overload, episode number 1 of a growing topic that will be addressed in depth here. There's so much information that I may start a completely different, not only Facebook group, but also designed around some solutions, because as I've researched very in depth with partners, with colleagues, because of the information out there and dissemination of myth information and a lack thereof, it's forced me to go solve some problems where they're not being solved. And as a result, I've realized how many more people struggle with this as a foundational piece, and yet they're continuing to go get treated for these other symptoms that we'd previously mentioned in this episode. Stay tuned for more episodes and more information, as well as solutions, as well as in a webinar that I will teach specifically some strategies so you can get your levels checked and get on board with your health. Thank you much for listening to this week's episode. I look forward to any feedback and or questions you might have. Direct them to our Facebook page, Frankly Speaking, Dr. Wade at Facebook. Okay, my fellow health warriors, it's time to head over to iTunes, franklyspeakingdrwade.com. There, you can rate, review, and subscribe, as well as share, so more of our brothers and sisters can grow to realize their voice. Speaking up means you matter. So, get on it. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views expressed are not medical advice and are not meant to replace the medical advice of your doctor. This podcast, including Dr. Wade Annenson and his guests, disclaim responsibility for any adverse effects you may experience from the specific use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse and accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about the guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for such services or product. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.